Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. This is a show where I take a look at every classic Doctor Who story, plus a bunch of Big Finish audio dramas, one episode a day, 7 days a week. And today, on the 15th of April, 2019, we are starting a look at the fifth story in the fourth series of Fourth Doctor Adventures, Suburban Hell, written by Alan Barnes. Now, Suburban Hell is actually off to a really solid start for a story. It doesn't waste any time in getting the Doctor and Leela into the action. We don't see the TARDIS arrive, and we basically spend quite a lot of our time, of time in the story, in this episode. Most of it actually just spent in this suburban little house in what's revealed to be the 2018, where this couple is getting ready for a party with some friends from work. They're sort of a dysfunctional couple. The wife is overbearing, and is just sort of this character who is obsessed with becoming part of high society. The wife's name is Belinda. She's played by Katie Wicks. She basically, she's basically like, oh, you calls her husband a failure through most of the story, and essentially is acting as if, her husband can't do anything right. No, you're basically terrible. It's a story where you get this real sense, it's not a good relationship for either of these people to be in. Where Ralph is just sort of this meek, this sort of mild-mannered character who's just like, I just sort of try to do what my wife tells me, and, just sort of try to live through it, which is, again, not a source of a good marriage, not the signs of a good, happy marriage. Belinda doesn't approve of her husband's friends, and the Doctor and Leela show up. They're convinced that, each of the couple are convinced that they're the other person's guests. It's one of those things. Now, what's weird is that because the TARDIS basically stopped working and then just disappeared, because the Doctor was tracking, basically a time disturbance. So the Doctor and Leela, they show up to the party, and they essentially, they essentially, try to make things up when a fog rolls in, and then, they start getting phone calls of people who sound terrified, and basically everything starts to fall apart. There's something out there in the fog. There are mentions of these weird pictures with people with a light bluish gray skin, and it's the rest of the first episode essentially tries to be almost a horror story. Like, one of the big reveals is that the Doctor and Leela aren't actually in the late 70s. No, they're in the year 2015. Nearly 40 years after they were supposed to arrive. It's actually quite a fascinating. It's one of those. It's a good sort of twist. Like, oh no, you're not actually in the time you thought you were. You're displaced from history. And it's something that is really well executed overall. Alan Barnes does a really good job of just springing this big revelation on you. Like, wait, this is actually what's going on here, without ever actually being like an explanation of, okay, here's what's going on here. It takes itself slow. It's a story that knows that it's got to take its time. It has to give enough time for the characters to react well. It's overall generally well written, but also generally just given quite a lot of time. Like, it's eventually revealed that the call on the phone was Belinda and Ralph trying to get help, because they started being stalked by creatures. Like, one of the actual guests Ralph invited. Once they go outside into the fog, they find essentially his dead body. He was killed by this creature who was stalking stalking our characters, and everything is just sort of building to this this tense idea that, oh, there's something really quite wrong here, something completely, totally and completely wrong here, something that just all the characters will not only need saving from, but the saving, the Doctor doesn't even know really what it is. It's a, it's basically it's basically playing on just the fear that that the characters don't know what they're doing, and they're trying to fend for themselves in this uncaring world environment where everything is everything is there to try to hurt you. It's really, really well written, and it's also really, really subtle. It's something that Alan Barnes does a really good job at creating. Tom Baker and Louise Jameson also play a lot of. There's also their clothes aren't questioned because it's a fancy dress party. So Leela gets flirted to, and she doesn't quite understand the flirting. There's these nice little flourishes that really give all the characters some depth, and also just the pacing of this episode is really solid. Intrigue stuff. You have this character played by Annette Badland from Over the Road, who is old and has lived there 40 years, and is basically there to get mayonnaise to help with creating a sauce for just the party. It's this interesting mix of almost horror and comedy that mostly mixes well. There's a couple of awkward moments that just don't quite finish to don't quite gel together very well, but other than that, it's genuinely pretty good. So I'm going to give Suburban Hell Part 1 a 9 out of 10. It is the 16th of April 2019, and I just finished listening to Part 2 of Suburban Hell, where dissonance essentially can be described as this episode, mainly because Alan Barnes decided to shift away from the sort of horror comedy aspect and basically go almost straight comedy for Part 2, and honestly it feels very mood whiplashy and sort of like we're watching a completely different episode, and having completely different experiences with these characters. Something that it doesn't make Suburban Hell gel very well. A lot is being built up about these alien acolytes who have essentially manipulated this woman's life. Thelma Over the Road is also an alien. That's a big revelation, because she's wearing a glamour basically to try to stop the acolytes, and the Doctor gets sent back to the 1970s, and he is responsible for stopping the acolytes. So it's sort of creating that linear paradox until the story just sort of decides, all right, we're going to stop and be done here by opening an alternate timeline of events in this localized area. It doesn't make too much sense. It's like, well, this is how the events were supposed to play out. Belinda was supposed to live her life normally with no kids, and the two other friends are supposed to get together and marry and have 4 kids. It's just weird. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, and it actively breaks up the flow. Just when it was getting going and getting good, the story's over. Which is weird, because the first episode did a really good job of getting the story started and getting it going quickly and moving at a good enough pace so we don't have to deal with something like that happening. Because let's be honest, that is a problem here. It's that the story ends up in this just sort of bad middle section. That's not to say Suburban Hell Part 2 is a bad episode. It's actually kind of enjoyable in places, and there's a lot of fun with it. It feels very Graham Williams, but when you set up a sort of, we're doing something with some horror elements, but also with comedy, you're kind of expecting a good mix of the both all the way through and not just going straight to horror. And it doesn't help that some of the comedy in the second episode, especially with the 2 acolytes, just doesn't work very well. It doesn't come across as particularly funny, and it doesn't really gel with what the rest of the story has done so far. It's overall just kind of a bit bland. Obviously, Tom Baker and Louise Jameson are great. Louise Jameson is especially good. Like, she gets to be. We're kind of rehashing a bit of plot points of Horror of Fang Rock, where she's like, and now the women have to fight. Which is well done. Louise Jameson, of course, does a great job with the material, and it's fun to listen to, even if it is a bit too derivative of another story for my personal tastes. It really could have been built up a little better. That we could have not had to deal with that sort of almost by this point kind of tired plot point of Leela having being sort of wacky with the feminine features of characters and things like that. It could have been built up a little better and written out a little more. There's a lot of stuff that Louise Jameson does here that is great. It is fun to listen to. Louise Jameson is great. Tom Baker's great. The supporting cast is great. We have a really good supporting cast for this story. There's a lot going in this favor. There's also again, once again, the music is weird. It's sort of jaunty, and there's points where it's very much laugh now, please. Which I don't think that flows very well with the story, because, well, if you're telling a story, you shouldn't be being like, all right, this is the point where you laugh. You can laugh now, because that's sort of what you have to do. It's not conclusive and adhesive to telling a good plot by being like, okay, audience, here are the keys. This is when you can laugh. Go on, audience. You know what you're doing. It makes it feel like the audience. It's like, do you think the audience is like dumb or something? Because it's this dangling of the keys, and it's something that Suburban Hell Part 2 really does suffer from. Now, again, same with the ending. It just sort of stops. There isn't much of a conclusion, and they almost sort of hand wave a bit like, oh, this is how it was supposed to go. So, overall, I'm going to give Suburban Hell Part 2 a 5 out of 10. And that being said, we add up the two episodes of Suburban Hell and average them out to give Suburban Hell a final score of 7 out of 10. Thank you everybody for watching this installment of the Ultimate Doctor Who Marathon. As always, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you've never already. And join me next time we take a look at the 6th episode of the 4th series of 4th Doctor Adventures, The Cloisters of Terror.